Eleanor's measuring tape slipped from her fingers the second the dressing room doors opened. The man standing in front of her was supposed to be dead. 5 years ago, she buried her husband after the shipyard fire. But now he stood in a billionaire's tailored suit, alive, powerful, and looking at her like she was a complete stranger. Her heart stopped, her breath vanished, and one terrifying truth hit her all at once. The billionaire the whole city called Julian Vane was her husband. The needle was more than a tool to Elena. It was a rhythmic anchor in a world that had tried to drift away from her. At 4:30 a.m., while the rest of Harbor City slept behind velvet curtains, Eleanor sat by a single flickering candle, her fingers already cramped into the shape of her labor. Each stitch was a scent, and each scent was a shield against the hunger that paced outside her door, like a wolf. She lived in the shadows of the city's poorest district, in an apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear the heartbeat of poverty, but her spirit remained as taut and resilient as the thread she pulled through the fabric. She paused for a moment to rub her swollen knuckles, her eyes drifting to the small cracked frame on the nightstand. Silas. In the faded photograph, his eyes held the warmth of a summer hearth, a stark, beautiful contrast to the frost creeping across her window panes. 5 years had passed since the shipyard fire that had supposedly stolen the air from his lungs and the light from her life. To the world, he was just a name on a casualty list, but to Elena, he was the ghost that sat at the edge of her bed every night, whispering that she had to keep going for the sake of the child sleeping in the next room. "Look, Mama," a small voice whispered from the doorway. Maya, only 7 years old and far too wise for her age, stood there clutching a crumpled piece of paper. She had drawn a man with broad shoulders and a gentle tilt to his head, a man who looked exactly like the father she had lost when she was only 2. "It's my hero, Mama. He's coming to help us, isn't he?" Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat, looking at the drawing. Maya was very observant, a trait she had inherited from a father who always looked for the best in people. "Yes, sweetheart," Eleanor lied, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. "Heroes just take the long way home sometimes." The moment of peace was shattered by a heavy, impatient pounding on the door. It was the landlord, a man whose heart was as cold as the December street he constantly threatened them with. "Rent's due, Elena. No more excuses, or you and the girl are out in the snow by Friday." His voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the thin wood. Elena closed her eyes, clutching her wedding ring, the one piece of gold she had refused to sell, where it hung on a chain beneath her patched clothes. Just as the weight of the world felt too heavy to carry, a second knock followed, more refined and deliberate. In the doorway stood a man in a navy suit, tailored so perfectly it moved like a second skin. He was from the Gilded Thread, the city's most prestigious boutique. He didn't look at the cracked plaster, he looked at Eleanor's calloused hands with professional assessment. "We have a contract for you," he said. "A wedding suit for Julian Vane, the Iron Tycoon. It involves the imperial silk, a fabric so rare that only a true master can be trusted with it. The fee will cover your debts for a lifetime." Eleanor accepted the job with a trembling hand, unaware that the silk she was about to touch was the very thread that would lead her back to her past. Vane Tower rose above Harbor City like a monolith of ambition, a cathedral of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the very clouds, casting a long, cold shadow over the bustling streets below. As Elena stepped through the revolving doors, she felt like a specimen in a naturalist's collection, her worn wool coat a dull grey blot against the blinding white marble and polished obsidian of the lobby. The air inside was different, filtered, chilled, and smelling faintly of expensive air freshener and the heavy, silent weight of power. She gripped her wooden shoe shine box, now repurposed to hold her tailoring tools, and felt the eyes of the security team move toward her like she was a threat that needed eliminating. She approached the reception desk, a massive slab of stone where a woman with hair pulled back in a style so tight it looked painful sat behind a glowing screen. Eleanor had spent 5 years perfecting the art of invisibility, a skill she had learned in the bread lines and the back alleys, and here, in this palace of capital, she felt her presence fade until she was little more than a ghost in a room of statues. The receptionist didn't look up for a long minute. She merely gestured with a manicured finger toward the private elevator, treating Eleanor not as a person, but as a necessary inconvenience. "Floor 60, the woman muttered, her voice as flat as the glass walls surrounding them. On the 60th floor, the elevator doors opened to an office so large it seemed to have its own weather system. Mrs. Higgins, the representative from the boutique, was already waiting, her face a mask of professional anxiety. She grabbed Elena's arm, her voice a sharp whisper that cut through the silence. "Remember, Julian Vane is a man of iron and logic. He does not like wasted time, he does not like chatter, and he certainly does not like the common folk touching him more than necessary. Just take the measurements and stay silent." Eleanor nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, though she didn't understand why the simple act of tailoring a suit felt like walking into a storm. Eleanor was ushered into a private dressing room that smelled of money and cedar, a space where every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a home. She set her tools on a velvet stool and began to prepare, her calloused hands trembling as she laid out the measuring tape and the shears. She felt a strange, unexplainable skin awareness, a prickle at the back of her neck that she hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of a world about to shift on its axis, the calm before a devastating collision. Then she heard it, a voice from the hallway. It was a deep, smooth baritone with an edge to it that made the air vibrate, a sound that sent a jolt of recognition through her body so intense it felt like a physical blow. It was a voice she had heard in her dreams every night for 5 years, a voice that had once whispered promises against her skin in the quiet dark of their small apartment. Her breath hitched, and she stood frozen, the measuring tape dangling from her numb fingers. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and a man walked in with the predatory grace of someone who had never in his life been denied anything he wanted. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Eleanor looked up, her heart stopping in her chest as she found herself face to face with a ghost. The sharp jawline, the broad shoulders, and those eyes, the color of winter storms, belonged to the man she had buried 5 years ago. It was Silas. Her husband was standing in the center of an empire, looking at her with the cold, distant gaze of a complete stranger. But as she looked at him, Eleanor didn't see a billionaire or a titan of industry. She saw a ghost she had buried 5 years ago, a man whose promises had once been the only warmth in her cold world. Julian looked at her with winter eyes, dark and analytical, eyes that seemed to absorb everything they looked at without giving a single spark of warmth back. There was no flicker of recognition in his gaze, no softening of his sharp jawline, only the professional distance of a man who was used to treating people as domestic appliances rather than human beings. He looked through her as if she were invisible, a specimen in a collection that he didn't have the time or the inclination to study. "Are you going to stand there all day?" His voice rang out, a deep, smooth baritone that vibrated in Elena's soul like a strike on a heavy bell. "The silk is waiting, and my patience for delay is non-existent." Eleanor's hands felt like lead as she reached for her measuring tape, her vision momentarily blurring with the kind of tears that Zara Hollet, once thought she was immune to. She stepped into his personal perimeter, an area that smelled of money and cedar, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical burden. As she began to measure the breadth of his shoulders, those same shoulders that had once carried their daughter through the park with such joy, she was hyper-aware of the heat radiating from his body. When her fingers accidentally brushed against the fabric of his sleeve, Julian went perfectly still. It was a brief, electric moment of skin awareness, a prickle of recognition that seemed to settle in the marrow of his bones, though his mind couldn't name it. She moved behind him, her touch as light as a whisper, and that was when she saw it. Just below his hairline, near his temple, was a small, moon-shaped scar. She remembered the exact moment he got it, how he had shielded her from a falling shelf in their first tiny apartment, laughing off the pain as if his own safety mattered less than her smile. The sight of it was like a physical blow, a confirmation that this man was indeed her Silas, despite the $3,000 suit and the cold, diamond-hard expression he wore. "Your hands are shaking," Julian observed, his voice losing some of its jagged iron edge and becoming almost curious. He turned to face her, his gaze narrowing as if she were a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to solve or discard. Does the prospect of tailoring for the Vane family truly cause this much distress? Eleanor forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat, her voice coming out as a raspy imitation of her usual strength. "It is the silk, sir," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his tie to avoid those winter storm eyes. "I have never handled fabric of such rare quality, and I am overwhelmed by the responsibility." It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. She couldn't tell him that he was the only quality she had ever truly valued, or that her responsibility was to a husband who didn't even know his own name. Julian studied her for a long moment, and for a heartbeat, the mask of the Ice King seemed to flicker, revealing a hollow place inside himself that no amount of success had ever been able to fill. He realized with a start that this was the first time in years an employee hasn't looked at him like a walking bank account. There was something in her eyes, something fierce, tired, and deeply honest, that made him feel seen as a man rather than a name on a building. He felt a sudden, unexplainable urge to remain in her presence, sensing that this stranger's touch held the rhythm of a homecoming he had spent 5 years trying to find. The silence in the dressing room was thick, a heavy, silent weight of power that seemed to press against the mahogany walls. Eleanor's heart continued its frantic rhythm, her fingers moving with the mechanical precision of a woman who had spent a decade holding her family together through sheer force of will. She was hyper-aware of Julian's presence, his broad-shouldered frame suggesting power held carefully in check, like a weapon that had learned to disguise itself as something less dangerous. The tension was momentarily broken by the rhythmic click of heels against the marble floor outside. The heavy doors swung open to reveal Clara, the woman the city knew as the strategic bride. Clara did not enter with the warmth of a woman in love, but with the proprietary confidence of someone who had already won a high-stakes negotiation. She was stunning, wearing a dress that surely cost more than Eleanor's annual rent, her hair pulled back in a style so tight it looked painful. Clara paused at the threshold, her nose wrinkling as she surveyed the room. "Julian, darling, why are we in this stuffy corner of the estate? This room smells of ancient dust and common labor," she said, her voice a sharp whisper that cut through the silence. She approached Julian, ignoring Elena as if she were a domestic appliance, and reached out to adjust a tie that didn't need fixing. Julian, however, didn't seem to hear her. His gaze was fixed on the small wooden box Eleanor had opened to retrieve her thread. While Clara smelled of expensive, cold perfume, Julian found his senses hijacked by a different aroma. He was drawn to the scent of the lavender oil Elena used to treat her thread, a subtle fragrance that felt like a bridge to a world he couldn't quite remember. As Elena pulled a length of silk through her wax, the scent intensified. In that moment, Julian's winter eyes clouding with a momentary confusion, he felt a sudden, unexplainable jolt of recognition, like a dam breaking in his mind. For a heartbeat, the pristine white ceilings of his life vanished, replaced by the flickering light of a small, warm kitchen. He could almost hear the sound of a low, tuneless hum, a lullaby that had forgotten its melody, sung by a woman whose face was obscured by the mist of his amnesia. "Are you finished?" Clara snapped, her eyes tracking Elena's hands with the sharp, calculating expression of someone who ate intimidation for breakfast. Elena didn't look up. She focused on the inner cuff of Julian's sleeve. With a steady hand, she performed a luck knot, a secret, intricate stitch taught to her years ago by Silas's mother. It was a signature of love, a hidden anchor meant to keep a traveler safe. As her fingers brushed against his wrist, she felt the intensity of his attention like a physical thing. Julian went perfectly still, his eyes absorbing the movement of her needle without giving anything back. "That stitch," Julian said, his deep, smooth baritone vibrating in the small space. "It is refined. Where did you study such calligraphy of the needle?" Eleanor finally met his gaze, her dark brown eyes wide and weary. "I taught myself from old patterns, sir. I was told that the knot in the thread is for luck, and that some things, though hidden, are never truly lost." Clara laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Nonsense. Luck is for those who lack the intelligence to command their own fate. Finish the suit, seamstress. We have a gala to attend." But Julian's mask of the Ice King had finally developed a crack. He looked around the room, at the minimalist luxury and the expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a home. For the first time in years, he felt the hollow place inside himself that no amount of success had ever been able to fill. He turned back to Elena, ignoring the strategic bride at his side. "You're different from most people I meet," he murmured, his voice losing its jagged iron edge. "Most look at this estate and see a kingdom, but standing here, surrounded by the best of everything, I find myself realizing that expensive furniture doesn't cure loneliness." Eleanor felt a tear prick her eye, but she blinked it away. She recognized that loneliness. It was the same one she had carried for 5 years. As she packed her tools, she knew the Iron Tycoon was still her husband, but he was a man playing a role instead of actually living. The scent of lavender had opened the door, and the luck knot had been tied. Now, she just had to wait for the thread of his memory to pull him all the way home. The private tailoring room at the Vane estate was a sanctuary of silence, a space where the heavy scent of cedar and expensive wool usually offered Elena a sense of professional focus, but today the air felt thin, as if the room itself were holding its breath. As Elena gathered her shears to begin the day's work on the imperial silk, her gaze was pulled toward a massive mahogany desk in the corner. In the center of that polished surface, sitting atop a stack of merger agreements, was a paperweight that seemed entirely out of place in this palace of glass and steel. It was an old silver pocket watch, its casing dented and its face scratched, as if it had survived a collision with fate itself. Eleanor's heart didn't just beat, it stuttered. Her hands, usually so steady with a needle, began to tremble with a violent rhythm. She knew that watch. She had polished it every Sunday for years. It was Silas's only inheritance from his father, a piece of history he had intended to pass down to Maya. He had been wearing it the night of the shipyard fire, the night the world claimed he had turned to ash. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the dented metal when the heavy doors swung open. Julian Vane walked in, his presence radiating that unsettling combination of power and stillness that had become his armor. His winter eyes immediately locked onto Eleanor, then dropped to her outstretched hand near the watch. "It's an eyesore, isn't it?" Julian's voice was a deep, smooth baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Eleanor's bones. He walked to the desk and picked up the watch, turning it over in his large, calloused hand. "My advisors tell me to throw it away. They say a man of my standing should have something more refined, but for some reason I cannot bring myself to part with it." Eleanor forced her voice to find a flat, professional edge, though it felt like a raspy imitation of her usual strength. "It looks like it has a story, sir. Some things are more valuable for what they've survived than what they are worth." Julian looked at her then, really looked at her, and the mask of the Ice King seemed to flicker for a heartbeat. "I wouldn't know," he admitted, his voice losing its jagged iron edge. "I was found with this watch 5 years ago. I was pulled from the wreckage of a fire with no name, no past, and no memory of the man who owned this. The Vane family, they needed an heir. Their actual son had passed away in secret, and they were desperate to protect their legacy. They found me, rebranded me, and gave me a script to follow instead of a life." Eleanor felt a wave of cold clarity wash over her. He wasn't a liar. He wasn't a man who had abandoned his family for a life of luxury. He was a man who had been stolen, molded into a corporate titan by a family that valued their stock price more than a human soul. He was living in a gilded cage, surrounded by the best of everything, yet he was lonely and isolated in a world that didn't actually belong to him. "You look as though you've seen a ghost, Miss Carew," Julian observed, stepping closer. The proximity sent a jolt of recognition through Eleanor, a prickle of skin awareness that screamed this was the man who had once promised to grow old beside her. "I was just thinking, sir," Eleanor whispered, her eyes fixed on the moon-shaped scar near his temple, "that money does not give you freedom. It gives you different constraints." Julian went perfectly still. That is an extraordinarily perceptive thing for a seamstress to say. "I have spent 5 years observing the world from the margins, Mr. Vane," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "I have learned that character is the skin we live in, but status is just a suit we wear. You may have forgotten your name, but the man who owned that watch, I suspect he was someone who valued truth over appearances. For a long moment, they stood in the silence of the fortress, two people whose souls recognized each other, even if their circumstances did not. Eleanor saw the hollow place inside him that no amount of success had ever been able to fill, and she realized that the Iron Tycoon was just a mask. She had the truth on the tip of her tongue. She wanted to scream his name, to tell him about the small apartment and the daughter who drew pictures of him every night. But she looked at the intensity in his grey eyes and felt a sudden, protective fear. The revelation would be a physical blow, a trauma that might shatter his stability before he was ready to handle it. He was a man playing a role, and if she ripped the script away too soon, he might lose himself entirely. "The suit will be ready for the final fitting tomorrow," Eleanor said, bowing her head as she began to pack her tools. "Thank you, Serenity," Julian said, and then he froze, his brow furrowing in confusion. I don't know why I called you that. Your name is Elena." Elena's heart leapt. Serenity, her middle name, the name he used to whisper to her in the dark. The dam was cracking. The scent of lavender and the rhythm of her needle were working. She didn't correct him. She simply smiled, a sad, beautiful expression of patience and restraint. "Perhaps you're just starting to remember that some things, though hidden, are never truly lost." She walked out of the room, leaving Julian staring at the dented watch, unaware that the thread of his memory was finally beginning to pull him home. The morning began with a crisis that tested the very limits of Elena's patience and restraint. The neighbor who usually watched Maya had been called away, leaving Elena with a choice that felt like walking a knife's edge. She could not miss the final fitting for Julian Vane's imperial silk suit, as the fee was her only shield against the cold December street, yet she could not leave her 7-year-old daughter alone in their tiny, decrepit room. With a heart full of uncertainty and fear, Eleanor dressed Maya in her best worn red sweater and brought her into the belly of the monolith, the Vane estate. Eleanor left Maya near the servants' entrance with strict instructions to remain invisible, a skill both mother and daughter had perfected over 5 years of survival. But Maya, possessed of her father's innocent curiosity, was soon drawn toward the estate's private gardens, a sprawling emerald landscape that looked like a fairy tale coming to life. In the center of the garden, near an ancient oak tree, Maya found a broken birdhouse that had fallen from its perch. She did not cry or look for an adult. She simply sat on the grass and began to fix it, using a discarded length of Elena's lavender-scented thread and a bit of impeccable logic. Julian Vane, seeking an escape from the heavy, silent weight of power that permeated his office, was walking through the grounds when he spotted the small figure. He should have called security. He should have enforced the rules of the restricted area. But something about the girl's focused stillness made him pause. He watched as she knotted the thread with a precision that was refined and strangely familiar. "It needs a secondary anchor," Julian heard himself say, his deep, smooth baritone startling even himself. Maya looked up with zero fear, her dark eyes the exact shape and warmth of the ones in Elena's nightstand photo, scanning his face with an intensity that was unsettling coming from a child. "The wind comes from the east, mister," she explained, gesturing with her small hand. "If I don't tie it here, the babies will fall when the storm comes. My hero says you always build for the storm." Julian felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with a hollow place inside himself he had forgotten existed. He slowly lowered himself to the grass, his charcoal suit that cost more than a year's rent disregarded in the mud. For the first time in 5 years, the Ice King was sitting on the earth, helping a stranger build something that didn't have a stock price. He felt a softness he had forgotten he possessed, his long fingers moving in sync with hers to secure the wooden roof. As they worked, Maya pulled a crumpled drawing from her pocket. "You look like my hero," she whispered, her gaze drifting to the moon-shaped scar near his temple. "But his eyes are happy. Yours look like they're waiting for the long way home." The words were a physical blow to Julian's carefully constructed armor of logic. He felt a crack in his fortress, a sudden, desperate relief as if a dam were breaking in his mind. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered near her hair, feeling a skin awareness that screamed of belonging. "Maya!" Eleanor's voice cut through the air, sharp with terror and panic. She burst into the clearing, her face pale as she saw her daughter sitting with the most powerful man in the city. But the sight stopped her breath for a different reason. There, in the golden light of the afternoon sun, was the image of the family she had lost, made manifest. Silas, the man the world called Julian, was looking at the girl with a tenderness that transformed his face from intimidating to something far more dangerous, a man with a heart. Julian stood up slowly, the mask of the Iron Tycoon slipping further than ever before. He looked at Eleanor, then back at the girl, and then at the gilded cage of his mansion in the distance. He realized in that moment that expensive furniture doesn't cure loneliness, and that the script he had been following was written in a language his heart no longer spoke. "She's very observant," Julian murmured, his winter eyes bright with a confusion that was rapidly turning into hope. He began to doubt if his strategic alliance with Clara was what his soul actually wanted. As Elena rushed to gather Maya, Julian didn't scold them. He simply watched them walk away, his mind swirling with nightmares of a fire, and the sudden, visceral need to know why a seamstress's daughter drew pictures of him before they had ever met. He realized that character is the skin we live in, and his skin was starting to itch under the weight of a name that wasn't his own. The gardens of the Vane estate were a masterclass in expensive minimalism, a place where even the grass seemed to grow, according to a corporate schedule. But following the moment under the oak tree, the atmosphere had shifted. The staff, usually a blur of surgical precision and cold silence, were now gathered behind the glass walls of the conservatory, their eyes tracking Eleanor and Maya with a mixture of calculating suspicion and shock. It was a breach of social hierarchy that the Iron Tycoon would disregard his merger meetings to sit on the damp earth with a seamstress's child. "Miss Carew," Julian said, his voice regaining its deep, smooth baritone as he stood and brushed the grass from his trousers. "The afternoon is cold, and you have been working since dawn. Please join me for tea in the pavilion." Eleanor felt the weight of a dozen stares. She knew that in this world, an invitation was rarely just an invitation. It was a puzzle to be solved. "Sir, I am here to finish a suit, not to occupy your furniture," she replied, her voice holding that fierce and tired resonance he had come to expect. Julian's winter eyes flickered with a hint of a smile, the first real one she had seen. "I find that I am weary of furniture that no one is allowed to sit on, and I am curious. Most people in this city would give anything to be in this garden. You look as though you are planning your escape." Eleanor conceded, not because of his power, but because Maya's eyes were wide with hunger. They moved to the marble pavilion, where a servant placed a tea service of gold-rimmed porcelain on the table. The luxury was staggering, yet as Elena watched Julian, she saw the hollow place inside him that no amount of success could fill. He looked at the ornate tea set as if it were a domestic appliance he didn't quite know how to use. "Why do you care?" Julian asked suddenly, leaning forward. "Why do you look at me not as a billionaire, but as someone you pity?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "I have learned that status is a suit we wear, but character is the skin we live in," she said softly. "You have the best of everything, Mr. Vane, but you carry yourself like a man who is lonely despite his best efforts. You are surrounded by people who tell you what you want to hear, but you have no one who knows the man beneath the charcoal wool." Julian went perfectly still. "You see too much, Serene. Elena." He caught himself, the name Serenity slipping out like a ghost from a half-forgotten dream. "I feel like a puppet whose strings are being pulled by someone else. I was given a name, a company, and a bride, but sometimes I wake up and I don't recognize the face in the mirror." Eleanor reached into her worn bag and pulled out a simple dented thermos. "The tea here is fine, sir, but it is made with rules, not with heart." She poured a small cup of the bone broth she had prepared for Maya, the same recipe Silas used to crave on rainy nights. "Try this. It is a recipe for a man who needs to remember where his feet are planted." The staff gasped as Julian Vane, the man who only consumed the finest vintages, took the humble cup from the seamstress's hands. As the first sip touched his tongue, the mask of the Ice King didn't just crack, it shattered. The savory, herbal warmth was a sensory trigger more powerful than any photograph. Suddenly, the marble pavilion and the glass towers began to tilt in his mind. For a heartbeat, the pristine silence was replaced by the sound of a shipyard whistle and the smell of salt air. He saw a flash of a woman's silhouette against a small kitchen window, humming a tuneless lullaby that sounded like home. His heart, which science had said was cold and logical, started to stutter and find a rhythm it hadn't known in 5 years. I know this," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. He looked at Elena, and for the first time, his winter eyes weren't cold. They were terrified. "Why do I feel like I've been waiting for this taste for a lifetime?" Elena looked at him with patience and restraint, her heart breaking for the man who was finally starting to realize he was a specimen in a collection, rather than an heir. "Because some things, Mr. Vane, are sacred," she whispered, "and love is the only ingredient that the world's richest man cannot buy." Julian stared at her, the drawbridge of his fortress beginning to lower. He realized that money doesn't give you freedom. It gives you different constraints. As they sat in the gathering shadows of the monolith, the thread of the past was no longer just a memory. It was a lifeline, and he was finally brave enough to pull it. The night following the trial of the tea was not one of rest for Julian Vane. The Iron Tycoon found himself paced within the confines of his master suite, a space of cold minimalist luxury that suddenly felt like a cage. Every time he closed his eyes, the mask of the Ice King was stripped away by a recurring nightmare. A roaring wall of fire, the acrid smell of salt air, and the desperate, melodic scream of a woman calling a name he didn't recognize. Silas. The name vibrated in the marrow of his bones, a frequency that his corporate brain couldn't decode, but his heart seemed to beat to. By 2 a.m., Julian realized that expensive furniture doesn't cure loneliness, nor does it quiet a soul that has finally started to scream. He needed answers that weren't found in merger agreements or stock portfolios. He needed to find the woman whose lavender-scented thread had tied a knot in his mind. The next morning, a sleek black vehicle that looked completely out of place in the modest streets of the Harbour District pulled to a stop in front of a dilapidated tenement. Julian emerged, his charcoal suit a sharp, dark blot against the grey, salt-stained walls of the neighborhood. He felt a strange jolt of recognition as he stepped onto the cracked pavement. His feet seemed to know the rhythm of these streets. His lungs seemed to recognize the heavy, humid air of the docks. He climbed the stairs of Elena's building, his winter eyes scanning the peeling wallpaper and the flickering lights. When he reached the door of apartment 4B, he didn't knock with the authority of a billionaire. He knocked with the hesitation of a man who was terrified of what he might find. Eleanor opened the door, her face pale, her dark brown eyes widening as she saw the titan of Harbour City standing in her hallway. "Mr. Vane, the suit. It isn't finished until this afternoon. I didn't come for the silk, Elena," Julian said, his voice a raspy imitation of its usual command. "I came because I can no longer live in a fortress of silence." He stepped into the small room, his presence filling the space until the air felt thick and hard to breathe. His gaze drifted to the small nightstand, landing on the cracked frame he had seen in his mind's eye during his nightmares. He picked it up, his fingers trembling as they traced the glass. In the photograph, a man with his face, but with eyes that held the warmth of a summer hearth, smiled back at him. The man in the photo was wearing a simple shipyard uniform, his arm around a younger, radiant Eleanor. "Who is this?" Julian whispered, the words falling like stones into still water. "That is my husband, Silas," Eleanor replied, her voice steady with patience and restraint, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm. "The world says he turned to ash 5 years ago, but I have always believed that some things, though hidden, are never truly lost." Julian looked from the photo to his own reflection, in a small, spotted mirror, on the wall, the moon-shaped scar near his temple, the breadth of his shoulders. The ghost he had been chasing wasn't a stranger. It was the man he used to be. He felt a physical blow of clarity, a dam breaking in his mind that released a flood of memories. The smell of the shipyard, the weight of a child in his arms, the taste of bone broth on a rainy night. "They lied to me," Julian murmured, his winter eyes finally turning a soft, turbulent grey. "The Vane family, they didn't save me. They stole me." He realized then that he had been a specimen in a naturalist's collection, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a family that needed a legacy more than they valued a human soul. They had given him a script to follow instead of a life, and he had played the role of the Iron Tycoon with surgical precision, unaware that his true life was waiting for him in a room that smelled of lavender and wood smoke. "I have to go back," Julian said, his jaw tightening into a line of iron. "I have to face them." "Julian, Silas, wait!" Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve in a gesture of protection and fear. "No," he said, looking at her with a fierce and tired intensity. "I have spent 5 years being what others needed me to be. I have lived in a palace of glass where the only reality was the profit margin. But standing here, looking at this photo, I realize that money doesn't give you freedom. It gives you different constraints. I am tired of being a ghost, Eleanor. I want to be the man who owned that watch. I want to come home." He walked out of the apartment, leaving Eleanor standing in the silence of her humble home. Julian drove back to the Vane estate, but he no longer saw it as a kingdom. He saw it as a gilded cage. He marched into the grand study where the Vane elders sat, surrounded by the best of everything, and threw the dented silver pocket watch onto the mahogany desk. "Tell me the truth," he commanded, his voice vibrating with the power of a man who had finally found his own name. "Tell me why you let a woman mourn for 5 years while you dressed a shipyard worker in charcoal wool and called him an heir." The silence that followed was heavy, the heavy, silent weight of power finally collapsing under the gravity of the truth. The elders looked at him, and for the first time, Julian saw them not as gods of industry, but as small, desperate people who had traded their integrity for a stock price. He realized that character is the skin we live in, and his skin finally felt like it belonged to him again. He was no longer Julian Vane, the Iron Tycoon. He was Silas, and he was finally ready to break every rule to find his way back to the light. The imperial silk suit was nearly finished, a shimmering testament to 5 years of grief and labor that now lay draped across a velvet mannequin like a specimen in a naturalist's collection. Eleanor sat by her sewing machine, her hands finally resting, though her heart continued to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was waiting for the collision she knew was coming, the moment the man the world called Julian Vane would return from his confrontation with the elders to face the truth of his own soul. When the mahogany doors finally swung open, the man who walked in was no longer the Ice King. Julian stood in the doorway, the heavy, silent weight of power that usually clung to him like a second skin having evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked younger, raw, and fundamentally shaken. He looked at Elena, and his winter eyes, once the color of storm clouds and old silver, were now turbulent with a desperate, burgeoning relief. "Why?" he asked, his voice a raspy imitation of his corporate command. He walked toward her, his fingers tracing the silver pocket watch he had brought back from the study. "Why didn't you tell me I was already home?" Eleanor stood slowly, her fingers brushing the chain of her wedding ring beneath her clothes. "Because I wanted you to choose me, Silas," she whispered, the name falling between them like a sacred vow. "I didn't want you to come back to me out of a sense of debt, or because you felt like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a different set of hands. I wanted you to choose this life for who you are now, not just because of who you were 5 years ago." Silas, for he could no longer think of himself as Julian, stepped into her personal perimeter. For the first time in years, the fortress of silence he had lived in felt truly dismantled. He realized that while he had been surrounded by the best of everything, he had been a man playing a role instead of actually living. He reached out, his hand trembling as he cupped her face, feeling a skin awareness so intense it felt like his entire body was waking up from a long, cold winter. I spent 5 years thinking that expensive furniture would cure the loneliness in my chest, he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back. I realize now that character is the skin we live in, but status is just a suit we wear. Then he kissed her. It was a soft and tentative kiss, a question asked by a soul that had been lost for half a decade. As their lips met, it felt like something inside was finally unlocking, a dam breaking that released a flood of belonging. In that moment, Silas knew that loving her was the right reason to break every rule he had ever been taught in the vain boardroom. The spell was broken by a soft sound from the shadows. Clara, the strategic bride, was standing near the dressing room screen. She didn't look like a villain who had been thwarted. She looked like a woman who was observing a miracle she had never been allowed to experience for herself. She had seen the way Silas looked at the seamstress, a gaze full of a warmth that no merger agreement or trust fund could ever manufacture. "You've been making sad eyes at each other for weeks, Julian," Clara said, her voice lacking its usual sharp negotiating edge. "I may be strategic, but I am not blind. Your heart has finally woken up, and it's clear that I was never the one it was beating for." Eleanor tensed, her protective instincts for Maya and Silas flaring, but Clara held up a manicured hand. "I'm not here to cause a scandal. I'm here because I, too, am tired of playing a role. My family wanted an alliance, but I want a life. If this seamstress is the one who can turn the Ice King back into a man, then she is the one you should be with." Silas looked at Clara with a new level of respect. "I am stepping down, Clara. I am leaving the vain empire to find the man who owned that shipyard watch." "I know," Clara replied with a sad, elegant smile. "And I think I'll take that trip to Paris I've been putting off. Life is too short to waste on convenient arrangements when real love is available." She turned to Elena, looking her in the eye with a genuine sincerity that bridged the gap between their worlds. "Take care of him, Elena. He was a specimen in a naturalist's collection for 5 years. He needs someone who knows how to handle a soul that's still a bit fragile." As Clara walked away, her heels clicking a rhythmic goodbye against the marble, Silas turned back to Elena. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers, and for the first time, the Iron Tycoon looked truly at peace. He realized that true success isn't about being seen by the world, but about being known by the people you love. "We have a lot to undo," Silas said quietly, "but I'm ready to start the journey, even if I cannot see the destination yet." Eleanor smiled, a tear of joy finally escaping. "You're not alone anymore, Silas. You're home." The morning of the scheduled merger announcement arrived with a sky the color of bruised pewter, casting a cold, flat light over the vain estate. Inside the fortress of glass and steel, the air was thick with the heavy, silent weight of power. Lawyers in charcoal suits moved through the hallways with surgical precision, clutching briefcases that held the fate of thousands of employees. For the Vane elders, this was to be the crowning achievement of their legacy, the final stitch that would secure their empire for a generation. But for the man they called Julian, it was the day the mask of the Ice King would be set aside forever. Silas stood in the center of the grand library, staring at the imperial silk suit that Eleanor had finished. It was a masterpiece, every stitch a testament to her patience and restraint. He traced the luck knot on the inner cuff, feeling a jolt of recognition that no longer terrified him. It was a lifeline. He was no longer a specimen in a naturalist's collection, a man without a past. He was Silas, and he was finally ready to stop being a puppet whose strings were being pulled by people who valued a stock price more than a human soul. A soft click of heels announced Clara's arrival. She was dressed in a suit of ivory wool, her expression holding a genuine sincerity that Silas hadn't seen in their 3 years of strategic compatibility. "The press is gathering in the ballroom, Julian," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp negotiating edge. She looked at him, really looked at him, and sighed. "But you aren't going to sign those papers, are you? Your winter eyes have changed. There's a fire in them now that doesn't belong to the Vane legacy." Silas turned to her, his posture straight and powerful. "I cannot marry you, Clara. I cannot lead this company under a name that was stolen from a dead man's pocket watch. I realize that expensive furniture doesn't cure loneliness, and building an empire on a lie is just building a taller cage." Clara smiled, a sad, elegant curve of her lips. "I know. I saw you with her, the seamstress. I saw the way you looked at her child. I realized then that life is too short to waste on convenient arrangements when real love is available." She reached out and touched his arm. "I've already spoken to my father. I told him I'm releasing you from the engagement. I'm going to Paris, Silas. I want to find a life where I'm not just a line item in a merger." "Thank you, Clara," Silas murmured, a weight lifting from his chest. But the true collision was yet to come. Silas marched into the boardroom where the Vane elders sat, surrounded by the best of everything. They looked up, their faces etched with a calculating suspicion as they saw he wasn't wearing the wedding suit. "Where is the silk, Julian?" the eldest Vane demanded. "The cameras are waiting." Silas threw the dented silver pocket watch onto the mahogany table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "My name is Silas," he said, his voice a deep, smooth baritone that shook the very foundations of the room. 5 years ago, you found a man with no memory and decided to turn him into a specimen to save your reputation. You let a woman and a child starve in the shadow of your towers while you dressed me in charcoal wool." The elders exchanged a glance of weary fear. They tried to argue, to speak of stability and the greater good, but Silas cut them off. "You told me that money was freedom," Silas said, looking at the moon-shaped scar on his hand. "But I've learned that money doesn't give you freedom. It gives you different constraints. I am stepping down. Effective immediately. The merger is cancelled. I am taking the man I used to be, and I am going home." The silence that followed was absolute. Silas didn't wait for their approval. He walked to the executive terminal and performed one final act under the name Julian Vane. With a few keystrokes, he transferred a portion of his personal, legitimate savings, funds he had earned through his own innovations, to clear every debt attached to Elena's name. He ensured the lease on her workshop was paid for a decade. He realized that status is just a suit we wear, but character is the skin we live in. As he walked out of the monolith, past the stunned security guards and the confused reporters, Silas felt the cold December air hit his face. It didn't feel biting. It felt like a baptism. He saw Eleanor waiting near the fountain, her worn wool coat a humble blot against the marble. "It's done," he whispered, taking her hand. "Are you sure, Silas?" she asked, her dark brown eyes wide with uncertainty and fear. "You're giving up a kingdom." Silas pulled her close, the scent of lavender on her skin finally filling the hollow place inside him. "I didn't give up a kingdom, Elena. I just realized that some things, though hidden, are never truly lost." Together, they walked away from the fortress of glass, two people who had survived a fire and a 5-year winter, finally ready to see if the thread of love was strong enough to sow a new life from the ruins of the old. The air in the harbor district was different than the filtered, chilled atmosphere of Vane Tower. It was thick with the scent of salt spray, the metallic tang of the shipyards, and the persistent aroma of wood smoke from the small tenements. For Silas, stepping back into this world felt like emerging from a fortress of silence into a symphony he had finally remembered how to conduct. He realized that for 5 years he had been living as a specimen in a naturalist's collection, a man whose every move was curated by a family that valued their stock price more than a human soul. His first act of reclamation was symbolic. In the small apartment that Elena had managed to keep through years of patience and restraint, Silas stood before a spotted mirror. He slowly peeled off the $5,000 charcoal suit, the armor of the Iron Tycoon, and felt the heavy, silent weight of power finally slide off his shoulders. He replaced it with a pair of faded jeans and a simple cotton t-shirt. As the fabric touched his skin, he felt a jolt of recognition that no board meeting had ever provided. Looking at his reflection, he didn't see the Ice King anymore. He saw a man who looked younger, raw, and fundamentally whole. He realized that status is just a suit we wear, but character is the skin we live in. "You look like yourself," Elena whispered from the doorway, her dark eyes wide and weary, with a joy she was still learning to trust. "You look like the man who promised to grow old with me." Silas walked toward her, the hollow place inside him that no amount of success had ever been able to fill, finally beginning to mend. "I spent 5 years thinking that expensive furniture would cure the loneliness in my chest," he murmured, taking her calloused hands in his. "But I was just a puppet whose strings were being pulled by people who didn't know my name. The most powerful thing I ever owned wasn't a company, Elena. It was my name. It was being yours." The weeks that followed were a blur of hard-won progress. Using the legitimate savings he had earned through his own engineering innovations, Silas didn't build another glass tower. Instead, he and Eleanor signed the lease on a spacious, sun-drenched corner building in the heart of the community. They named it the Serenity Loom, a fair-trade textile boutique designed to employ the women of the district who had spent their lives being invisible. Silas spent his days using his Iron Tycoon strategic mind to organize supply chains for local weavers, while Eleanor handled the calligraphy of the needle. He found a new kind of effectiveness, not the kind that moved markets, but the kind that moved people's lives from desperation to hope. He realized that money doesn't give you freedom. It gives you different constraints, and he chose the constraints of a life built on truth. The most profound change, however, happened in the evenings. Maya, who had spent years drawing a hero she thought was a ghost, finally had a father who could teach her how to build things that lasted. They sat on the floor of the new boutique, surrounded by rolls of silk and the scent of lavender oil. Silas didn't talk to her about mergers. He talked to her about the luck knot and the importance of an anchor that could withstand the storm. One Saturday, as they worked together to fix a set of display shelves, Maya looked up at him with the innocent curiosity of a child who saw the world without filters. "Your eyes are different now, Daddy," she said, her small hand reaching out to touch the moon-shaped scar near his temple. "They don't look like they're waiting anymore. They look like they're home." Silas felt a physical blow of emotion, a desperate relief that made his breath hitch. He pulled his daughter into a tight embrace, realizing that this warmth was more precious than any kingdom he had abdicated. That night, the family of 3 sat around a simple wooden table, eating a meal of simple but plentiful food, the bone broth that had once served as a sensory trigger for his returning memory. There were no servants, no mahogany walls, and no cameras. There was only the sound of laughter and the rhythmic ticking of the old, dented silver pocket watch Silas had reclaimed from the veins. As Silas looked at Elena across the candlelight, he realized that his second chance wasn't just about getting another opportunity. It was about being wise enough to recognize it and brave enough to take it. He had started as a man who had everything and nothing, and he had become a man who had a fraction of the wealth, but everything that made life worth living. "I may have forgotten my name for a while," he whispered to Elena, his voice steady with peace, "but my heart never forgot the rhythm of your needle." The Ice King was dead, but Silas had finally found the long way home. The porch of their home in the harbor district had become their sanctuary, a wooden stage where the drama of their lives had finally found its peaceful resolution. As the sun began its slow descent over the water, it painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, a celestial embroidery that no needle could ever hope to replicate. Silas stood by the railing, the salt air of the docks mingling with the scent of lavender that always seemed to cling to Elena, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel like a specimen in a naturalist's collection. He felt like a man who had finally found the long way home. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once signed merger agreements worth millions, and had later learned the calligraphy of the needle at the Serenity loom. He traced the moon-shaped scar near his temple, no longer seeing it as a mark of a tragedy, but as a map of his survival. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" Eleanor's voice was a soft anchor in the evening quiet. She stepped beside him, her presence filling the hollow place inside him that wealth had never been able to touch. "I was thinking about the fire," Silas admitted, his voice a deep, smooth baritone that held no more of the Iron Tycoon's ice. "For so long, I saw that night as the moment my life ended. I saw the smoke and the pain as a wall that separated me from everything real. But standing here, watching the light hit the water, I realized that sometimes the best meetings start with a mess. If the world hadn't burned down that night, I might have spent my life as just another man in a shipyard, never knowing the strength of the woman I married or the depth of the love that would eventually pull me from the wreckage." Eleanor smiled, reaching out to take his hand. She looked down at their intertwined fingers and felt a quiet surge of pride. "I remember how my hands used to shake," she whispered. "In those first years, every time I picked up a needle, I was terrified that the thread would snap and we'd be left with nothing. I was stitching against the cold December street, trying to hold a broken world together. But look at them now." She held her hands up in the golden light. They were calloused and marked by years of labor, but they were steady with peace. They were the hands of a master, not just of fabric, but of her own fate. They stood in the gathering shadows, realizing that their journey had taught them a truth the fortress of glass could never understand, that patience is not weakness, but strength expressed through restraint. It would have been easy for Elena to scream the truth the moment she saw him in the vain boardroom. It would have been easy for Silas to stay in his gilded cage, protected by his billions. But they had both chosen the harder path, the path of waiting, of observing, and of allowing the heart to find its own rhythm again. They had learned that status is just a suit we wear, but character is the skin we live in. "I made a lot of promises when I was Julian Vane," Silas said, turning to Elena with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I promised investors returns. I promised the city stability. But those were just scripts written by people who didn't know my soul. From this moment on, I only have one promise that matters." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, in a gesture of protection and belonging. "I promise to choose you every single day forever. Not because I have to, or because a contract says so, but because there is no world I want to inhabit where you aren't the rhythm of my needle." Below them, in the small garden where the herbs grew tall, Maya was playing with a wooden birdhouse Silas had helped her build. She was laughing, her dark eyes bright with the innocent curiosity of a child who no longer had to draw heroes in the dark. Silas and Elena watched her, knowing that while she would never inherit a list of corporate titles, she was inheriting something infinitely more valuable. She was inheriting a legacy of love instead of just gold. She was growing up in a home where the most powerful thing anyone owned was their own name, and where the thread of love was strong enough to withstand any storm. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared, leaving the harbor in a gentle, indigo twilight, they knew that their story was a testament to the fact that some things, though hidden, are never truly lost. Dear friends, this story reminds us that status is a suit we wear, but character is the skin we live in. True success isn't about being seen by the world, but about being known by the people you love. We often chase the best of everything, thinking it will fill the void, only to realize that expensive furniture doesn't cure loneliness. Second chances aren't just about getting another opportunity. They're about being wise enough to recognize it and brave enough to take it. If you are lost today, remember, there is a thread of love that can always lead you back to yourself. For some things, though hidden, are never truly lost. Whatever bridges you've burned, know that change is possible and redemption is real. Stay blessed, Hope Nation. And remember, the person who drives you crazy might just be the one who saves your life. The end. Thanks for watching. This is your storyteller, Mr. Hope. Please subscribe.